young women would go out to work. They might work for, say, 10 years. During that time, build up a pot of savings and decide for themselves whether, when, and who to marry. It is that ability to get out of your family home and to engage in a paid form of labour over which you have full control as a woman that is important.
To you, Dr. Bateman, one of the comments that people might initially make on your thesis, that one of the big advantages that Britain had and Northwest Europe had was the relative emancipation of women compared to other parts of the world. Well, many people would say, women in the 18th or 19th century didn't have the vote. Their property was often locked up with their husbands. In what meaningful way were British women more liberated than women in China or the Ottoman Empire?
Yes, such a great question. And I think actually one of the best measures of how free a woman is, and still a good measure today, is to what extent she has control over whether, when, and who she marries. So for much of history, daughters have been married off by their fathers often to men might be double the age of their daughters. And the result is that they are then committed to produce child after child, to domestic drudgery, for performing unpaid labour, essentially, for their economy, producing the next generation. Now, what I think is one of the most surprising facts about the British economy in the centuries on the run-up to the Industrial Revolution is the average age that a woman got married, and this is first marriage, so this isn't second marriages, third marriage, was 25 or 26 years old. So young women, and this isn't just Britain, this was northwestern Europe in general, young women typically left home as teenage girls and they went out onto the labour market. They performed paid work. Now that might be in domestic service or it might be in agricultural labour, say as milkmaids. I mean, one of the great things that stimulated women's rights was cattle, cows, and all the dairy that came with that. So young women would go out to work. They might work for, say, 10 years. During that time, build up a pot of savings and decide for themselves whether, when, and who to marry. And actually, a good portion of British women decided not to marry because they had that freedom to do that. A good 10%, sometimes a little bit more, depending on what century you're looking at. And those that did marry were able to find a partner of their own choosing, a consensual marriage, and married once the two of them had built up enough of a pot of savings to start their own household, their own nuclear household. So women were not under the watchful eyes of their parents-in-law. They were in command of their own households. And this is what I argue in this book. So the seeds of the rise of the British economy. Because, I mean, I look at 4 or 5 different ways in which this helped the British economy. And one is that if women are marrying later in life, they're having smaller families. And those smaller families help to keep population under control. And that in turn feeds through to create a higher wage economy that inspires technological change, mechanization, that puts the capital in capitalism, as a Marxist might want to call it. So it's not cheap labour, it's expensive labour that drives that. Also, with these smaller, higher wage families, people can better afford to save. They can better afford to educate their children. They're having fewer of them, so they can afford to apprentice at least some of their children. And also the very fact that in this type of economy, that in order to get married, you have to make your own way in the world, set up your own nuclear household, that inspires a work ethic and entrepreneurism that other people have called the Protestant work ethic or the capitalist spirit. Because unless you work hard, take advantage of training opportunities and save, you simply cannot get married, you cannot have children, you cannot have a sex life in the way that perhaps most people want. Whereas in most parts of the world, people's parents look after that marriage decision for them. And so what happens to a young person, what happens to their future, is much less dependent on their own individual effort and much more dependent on their extended family. So it's in those ways that I argue that women's freedom was particularly crucial for laying the seeds of the Industrial Revolution.
And presumably there's also a culture of women going out into the wage economy,
Absolutely.
Getting money, which is a big advantage for factories early on.
Well, that is really key because, in so many of these empires that I've mentioned, women were working. They were typically working in a way that was invisible to the rest of the economy. So it might be, say, spinning and weaving within their homes. It might be making pottery. So in a sense, CEOs of their own little household economy, their husband might be out working in the fields, and then your wife might be grinding corn, making pots in your hearth, and making cloth. And actually, cloth was one of the things that was most taxed by, for example, the Chinese dynasties in history. But that was behind closed doors. It was a kind of labour that women themselves didn't necessarily have full control over. It is that ability to get out of your family home and to engage in a paid form of labour over which you have full control as a woman that is important. Now, what's interesting is with some of the early factories in East Asia, one of the ways that recruitment took place was to go to the fathers of young women and essentially ask them to sell their daughter into labour into a factory.
Is this in the 20th century?
This is in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so you have women in factories, but it is their fathers that are getting their pay packet rather than the women themselves.
Right.
So I think, it is quite an astonishing, fact. Women have worked everywhere throughout history, but this ability for women in particularly northwestern Europe to have this control over their own financial independence. And I think, too much today we take for granted the idea that, one, women can go out to work, two, that they can keep their earnings, three, that they can be proud of that work rather than ashamed of going out into the workplace, and four, that they have the freedom to decide what they spend their income on. And all four of those things, all four of those aspects of economic freedom are things that societies and states have greatly tried to limit throughout human history.
But